and welcome to this week's edition of Business Immigration Training. I'm Sam Adair with the law firm of Graham Adair, and I'm joined today by my partner, Chad Graham. Chad, thanks for being here.
Hello there, everybody. Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be talking about every immigration lawyer's favorite topic, which is document retention requirements. But we live in an era of increasing cooperation between government agencies, an era of an increasingly mobile workforce with people working hybrid or out of the office completely. And companies are reassessing their document retention policies and compliance policies as we deal with this new landscape. And so, Chad, today we're going to talk specifically about document retention requirements as it relates to employment-based immigration. And so let's go ahead and just jump right in here. Chad, what are the main categories of documents that companies have to retain as part of this process?
Well, and you hit the nail right on the head there, Sam. I mean, for those of us involved in the business immigration world, there's just sort of documents flying all around, hopefully not literally, but figuratively. And so what documents are really controlled by regulation? And there are three that we need to focus on, and they are the Form I-9, the public access file with the labor condition application or the LCA, and then the perm labor certification documentation. Those are the three forms that are governed by regulation in terms of how long they need to be retained.
And who has the responsibility for retaining these documents?
This is a really great point and something that companies should be aware of, that they are the ones that are responsible for these documentation. A lot of times companies will ask their law firms to maintain these files for them. It's not something that they should just turn over to the law firm and assume that it's being done correctly. My advice to companies is that as part of their annual review of their immigration program, that this is something that should be reviewed as well to be sure that the required documentation is being retained, and almost as importantly, being purged as it's eligible to be purged. Because what a company does not want to come up against is an audit where there's a lot of documentation that could have been purged legally, but is still being retained unnecessarily, and therefore is a subject of that audit and potential liability for the company.
Yeah, those are great points. Thank you. Chad, can you get into the specifics a little bit on these three different categories of documents and how long the regulations require that they be retained?
So the I-9, the retention requirement is 3 years from the date of hire of that employee's hire, or 1 year after the termination of that employee, whichever is longer. So it's either or, but it's whichever is longer. 3 years after the hire date or 1 year after the termination. The second one, for the public access file and the LCA, it's a similar sort of either or scenario. It's 1 year after the LCA expiration date or after the LCA is withdrawn, whichever is longer. And then for the perm labor certification, it is required to be maintained for 5 years. The one note that I will make here is that there is not a statute of limitations for when a perm labor certification can be revoked. And so potentially maintaining that documentation longer might be a good idea. And this is one of those areas where I advise companies to consult with their immigration attorneys to make sure they have a sound policy around that.
Chad, back when I started doing this, I would go visit clients and they would have these just hulking file cabinets that were full of documents. And sometimes they were really neatly organized. Sometimes it felt like papers were just stuffed in them. And
flying around, right?
Oh yeah, completely. And I'm worried about the implications for the Dunder Mifflin Paper Company, but what about electronic storage nowadays when it comes to retaining these documents?
Yeah, I do fear that Michael Scott might be looking for a new job here pretty soon. And actually, the switch to a digital and electronic started a long time ago, probably when The Office started filming. But like many things within the immigration world, we're a little behind the times. And so the effort to move electronic started later and is sort of being adopted by more companies right now. And I'm all for electronic storage. I think one of the concerns initially was data privacy and making sure that documents are not running afoul of data privacy laws, especially now that there are a lot more and there's a lot more enforcement within that area. But those issues have been vetted by most solutions out there. And so that's a factor to keep in mind. But it does provide a lot of additional flexibility, fewer file cabinets to keep the actual paperwork. And you can set within the software reminders for when documentation can be purged. Because as I said before, it's almost as critical to purge documentation that can legally be thrown away as it is to maintain the documents that are required to be maintained. So I think moving to electronic storage is definitely something that companies should be thinking about.
Let's talk just a little bit here too about documents that may not have a legal or regulatory retention requirement. Are there any other documents that companies should be thinking about retaining or having policies in place as it relates to other documents that aren't mandated by the regulations?
Yeah, this is another area to be thinking about as well. Even though there's not specific regulation, there are requirements on the law firm side, legally and ethically, for document retention. And as I mentioned previously, there are data privacy laws that are implicated here. So my advice is for companies to consult with their law firm on how long to maintain documentation, such as a previous H-1B petition that has been filed, because the hope is that, at some point, if somebody gets down the road and if they need those documents, that they're able to get those from the law firm. So again, it's an area that companies should be thinking about, not necessarily responsible from a regulation perspective, but from a best practices perspective, it's something that they should be thinking about.
Excellent. Well, Chad, thank you so much for being here with us today. I think that this gives us a lot to think about and is certainly a helpful jumping off point for companies as they start to reevaluate or evaluate their document retention policies. So thanks so much and have a great week, everybody.
Yeah.